April 1985. The wind over the steppe outside Saratov cuts like wire. Deep beneath it, inside a concrete-reinforced bunker, a missile crew watches a red bulb flicker. No alarms, no noise, just a single pulsing light. It's not a drill, not exactly. It's a real-time readiness test. A simulated NATO first strike, launched to test the reflexes of the Soviet nuclear command. The scenario, a surprise decapitation attack that knocks out top-level command and leaves only the strategic protocols to guide a response. From the outside, the system is unbreakable. 4 separate communication networks layered, compartmentalized, hardened against EMP, sabotage, and failure. Satellite uplink, wired command relay, low-frequency submarine net, courier confirmation fallback. Even if 3 go down, 1 survives. That's the doctrine. That's the shield. But tonight, the impossible happens. At 22:41 Moscow time, the primary satellite channel fails. It's noted, but not feared. Backup number 1 activates. At 22:43, the landline relay network reports 0 signal return from 2 missile divisions. At 22:46, the ultra-low-frequency submarine channel reports synchronization loss, no signal confirmation, no acoustic response. At 22:50, the courier channel fails to dispatch from Vinnytsia command post. Across the USSR, crews begin to stare at dead screens. Confirmation codes aren't arriving. Readiness pings go unanswered. Silence spreads not just across 1 channel, but all 4. In less than 17 minutes, the entire Strategic Rocket Forces network goes dark. 1 crewman, buried beneath the Ural Mountains, whispers, "What if we've already been hit inside the Kremlin's General Staff War Room?" The room dims. The Chief of Staff demands a line trace. Nothing. An aide suggests launching the perimeter fallback dead hand, the autonomous retaliatory system. But it requires manual activation from a live command. And right now, command is silent. In that moment, with over 3,000 strategic warheads disconnected, no one in the Soviet military knows whether Moscow is intact or already ash. And worse, no one knows what's real. Sabotage NATO jamming a solar flare. Or the most terrifying option, that the backup systems designed to save them all failed together. For decades, Soviet Strategic Command believed it had solved the one problem that haunted every nuclear power communication under attack. The solution was redundancy. Not just one backup, but layers. Each system hardened differently, routed differently, protected against different threats. Satellites for speed, landlines for reliability, ultra-low-frequency transmitters for submarines hiding under the ice, couriers for the nightmare scenario where electronics failed entirely. The assumption was simple and fatal. No single event could silence them all. That belief shaped everything. Training manuals, war games, promotion criteria. The idea that Moscow might ever be unable to speak to its own forces was treated as fantasy. Command could be degraded, yes. Slowed, perhaps, but never erased. And so, there was no doctrine for total silence. In the General Staff War Room, officers were trained to handle partial failure. If satellites went down, shift to landline. If landline failed, ULF would still whisper through the earth and sea. If even that failed, couriers would move slow, human, unstoppable. But nowhere in the binders was a page titled, "What if everything fails at once?" Because to admit that possibility was to admit fragility, the Soviet system was built around central authority. Orders flowed outward, confirmation flowed back. The entire nuclear deterrent depended on a heartbeat, Moscow issuing commands, and the forces responding in lockstep. Redundancy existed, but it was layered vertically, not independently. Each backup relied on the same assumptions, the same synchronization clocks, The same authentication codes, the same command logic, the same software timing windows, different wires, different frequencies, but the same brain. No one had considered that a single flaw timing, synchronization, protocol could cascade across every layer simultaneously, because the systems were designed by different bureaus, installed at different times, but updated together. Patches were rolled out centrally, authentication tables were synchronized nightly, clock drift was corrected across all networks at once, efficiency was prized, uniformity celebrated, resilience was assumed, so when the first channel went dark, no one panicked. When the second failed, irritation replaced concern. By the third, officers began checking maps and clocks. By the fourth, the room fell quiet. This wasn't an enemy attack. This was something far worse. The architecture itself was betraying them. And in that room of wrong assumptions, Soviet Strategic Command faced a truth it had never trained, for redundancy does not mean independence, and multiple backups can still share a single point of failure. The cornerstone of Soviet nuclear doctrine wasn't technology, it was control, centralized, unyielding, top-down control. No launch could occur without explicit authorization from Moscow. No unit could act autonomously unless the state itself was judged obliterated. This doctrine, codified in the 1970s under Strategicheski Utkaz, protocols placed absolute authority in the general staff and absolute obedience in the field. The system had no room for improvisation. Missile crews, bomber pilots, submarine captains, they were the arms. The Kremlin was the mind. If the mind went silent, the arms were to freeze, await further instruction, or accept their own annihilation. There were emergency procedures, but even those required one key signal: continuity. If contact was lost and then regained, Moscow could resume command. But what if contact never resumed? There was a protocol, buried deep in the layers of contingency perimeter. The semi-automated retaliation system, nicknamed Dead Hand in the West, designed to trigger if top command was wiped out. But even perimeter required confirmation of three things: a nuclear event on Soviet soil, command silence, manual activation by at least one surviving officer with coded clearance. It was terrifying in theory, but on this night, none of those conditions were technically met. No detonations, no confirmed attack, just silence. Not total, not catastrophic, just enough failure to paralyze the chain of command. And that's where the doctrine began to crack. Field commanders didn't know if the silence meant enemy attack, technical malfunction, or internal sabotage. Some assumed jamming. Others feared Moscow had been destroyed. A few believed it was the start of the real war, and still, no one moved, because no one was allowed to. A colonel in an ICBM regiment near Tomsk drafted a launch prep signal, but held it. His superior had not approved it. A Delta III submarine off the Pacific coast received half a targeting packet. The captain initiated readiness drills, then canceled them after a sonar technician said he couldn't confirm the signal source. A long-range bomber wing was already airborne for a routine patrol. Its crew circled, waiting for a recall or a redirect. Neither came. They stayed in the sky 2 hours longer than fuel parameters allowed, too afraid to land, too afraid to act. This wasn't a failure of discipline. It was a failure of doctrine. The system demanded obedience. Obedience demanded clarity. And clarity had vanished. Soviet Strategic Command now faced a paradox it had never planned, for the more control it centralized, the more fragile it had become in the moment control disappeared. At 23:02 Moscow time, an ICBM regiment stationed outside Plesetsk initiated Phase 2 protocol. Their communication monitors displayed static. The satellite uplink had failed. Ground relays had not responded. The low-frequency confirmation ping, usually received every 45 seconds, had gone silent for nearly 10 minutes. Protocol dictated they remain at readiness and await further instruction. But something changed. The regiment's backup authentication system, a fail-safe rarely used, blinked a yellow alert. That system, supposedly independent, had just flagged an unreconciled signal loss across all channels. In Soviet doctrine, that level of failure didn't exist. There was no checklist, no scenario for it. The commanding officer, a colonel with 19 years in the Strategic Rocket Forces, stood frozen. The alert light blinked. The comms console was dead. The next scheduled signal was overdue by 11 minutes. Somewhere in his training, the colonel remembered a phrase from a briefing: "If Moscow is dark and the missiles are blind, we prepare, not fire." He activated internal systems. Warhead safing protocols were disengaged. Fueling hatches open. Pre-launch coolant flow began. He did not arm the missiles. He just moved them one step closer. Meanwhile, 2,000 kilometers away, a Soviet nuclear submarine in the Arctic, prowling below the ice, lost its coded daily ping. This wasn't abnormal. Submarine comms were notoriously unstable. But this time, the backup didn't engage. Neither the ELF burst nor the courier code arrived. The captain considered surfacing. Doing so would expose the vessel to Western sonar nets, but also allow access to alternative communication. The executive officer objected. Orders are silence unless fired upon. They remained submerged, disconnected, armed, and alone. Then came the bomber wing, stationed outside Saratov. 2 Tu-95s received a partial command launch readiness, no targeting coordinates. The crew interpreted it as a decoy exercise, but the accompanying satellite pass never happened. Their scheduled air-to-ground data link was dead. They climbed anyway, cruising over the Urals, fully fueled, loaded with payloads meant to cross Europe in 6 hours. They banked east, awaiting coordinates that never came. For 23 minutes that night, the 3 legs of the Soviet nuclear triad land, sea and air, operated without synchronization. Each obeyed the last confirmed instruction. Each held position, awaiting leadership. But leadership was silent, and for the first time since the dawn of the Cold War, the Soviet Union's nuclear war machine was on the move without command. There were no detonations, no launches, no shots fired, just 3 separate branches of apocalypse, waiting for someone to speak. Back in the Kremlin's underground war room, disbelief reigned. When the first confirmation failures were reported, the response was dismissive. A glitch, a relay hiccup, satellite drift. Nothing unusual on their own. But then the second system failed, and the third. And by the time the courier net reported silence from multiple regional nodes, the words no one wanted to hear emerged in a dry, matter-of-fact tone from the communications chief. "We have lost contact across the full spectrum." For a moment, there was no reaction. Then shouting. The chief of the general staff barked, "This is sabotage." The defense minister countered, "It's NATO. Jamming exercises." The KGB liaison suggested internal subversion, comms traitors. We've seen it before. No one in that room considered the simplest explanation, that the system had failed on its own. Instead, they defaulted to blame. The landline relays were accused of poor maintenance. Satellite engineers were summoned from Baikonur mid-shift. The Naval Comms Bureau in Murmansk was ordered to rebroadcast every emergency packet from the past 6 hours. Still, no response. Backup procedures were initiated, burst transmissions on low-bandwidth reserve channels, emergency line resets, even Morse, code fallback signals broadcast into the void. Nothing came back. In the bunker below, one general slammed his fist into the control table. Why aren't they responding? Are they dead? Are we... It wasn't melodrama. With every passing minute, the silence grew louder. It wasn't just communication loss. It was the total absence of confirmation. And without confirmation, doctrine permitted nothing. No launches, no alerts, no retaliation. The Soviet war machine, for all its might, was designed to hold still unless told to move. And now, no one could move, not forward, not back. A decision had to be made. Some argued to activate perimeter the semi-autonomous response system, just in case. But that required a dual-key manual order and proof of nuclear impact. Neither condition was met. Others whispered about going dark, shutting down readiness until the network came back online. But doing so would mean gambling that this wasn't a first strike. The highest-ranking officer in the room, a marshal who had served through the Cuban Missile Crisis, sat in silence. Then, finally, he spoke. If we act now and we're wrong, we end the world. If we wait and we're wrong, we end ourselves. What we need is time. And all our time just vanished. It was the clearest summary of the crisis. Not a loss of weapons, not a loss of territory, a loss of something deeper, certainty. And in the halls of a regime that trusted nothing but centralized control, that was the most unthinkable defeat of all. By dawn, a new theory had taken root, one that offered comfort in the form of an external threat, atmospheric disturbance. According to this hypothesis, a sudden ionospheric shift, perhaps triggered by solar activity, had interfered with satellite signals, disrupted ultra-low frequency transmissions, and scrambled high-altitude data relays. A solar event. They called it convenient, abstract, blameless. The State Meteorological Bureau was ordered to produce data supporting the claim. A report was compiled in under 6 hours. Charts, diagrams, plasmographs, all perfectly plausible, none accurate. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. But Moscow didn't want simplicity. It wanted a cause that didn't implicate its systems. Engineers were ordered to recalibrate satellite relays, raise frequencies, boost power. Submarine broadcast centers reinitiated pulse sequences. Landlines were rechecked for physical damage. When nothing changed, Command insisted the event had passed. Then the reports trickled in. Maple 3, the command relay satellite, had not experienced signal interruption from space. Landline servers showed no external damage. The submarine ELF transmitters showed perfect internal signal generation, but logs indicated no response from receivers. Even stranger. The control codes sent out from central Moscow had not been echoed back. That was impossible. If it had been jamming, there would have been noise. If it had been a solar flare, partial static would have returned. But these channels weren't noisy. They were dead silent. A blank response. Yet Moscow clung to its atmospheric theory. Why? Because if it wasn't space, and it wasn't sabotage, then it meant the system had failed from within. That possibility was too dangerous to speak aloud. So the weather became the villain. Military channels were flooded with instructions. Verify comms calibration. Tune receivers to new offsets. Check antenna alignments. Units responded robotically, each one reporting back no deviation detected. But the silence had already lifted. Signals began flowing again. Slowly, unevenly, like thawed ice cracking open. But no one could explain why it had stopped. And no one could admit that for nearly 30 minutes. The entire Strategic Rocket Forces network had been blind. Field units began reporting false alarms and ghost echoes. Some crews received delayed packets hours later, stale orders, stripped of urgency but now impossible to delete. When the logbooks were reviewed, timestamps clashed. Orders were out of sequence. Some warhead safing commands arrived after the prep routines. Some submarines received targeting data with no context. None of this fit the solar event theory. And yet, the official record said minor communications anomaly due to atmospheric instability. System recovered. No further action required. That was the lie they wrote. Because the real cause would shake everything. A simultaneous failure of every backup channel triggered not by the sun, but by something they built themselves. When atmospheric interference couldn't explain the silence. A darker theory crept in, one the KGB was all too eager to support: internal sabotage. If all systems failed together, perhaps they were made to, not by enemies in the sky, but traitors within the network. The logic was chilling and politically useful. Sabotage explained the synchronization of failure. It offered an enemy to hunt. It reinforced the need for loyalty checks. And most importantly, it allowed the Soviet system to preserve the illusion that its technology had not failed on its own. Within hours, internal counterintelligence teams launched discreet sweeps. Communications officers were pulled from their posts. Satellite control technicians were interrogated. Data logs were seized and classified. No arrests were made, but fear spread like fallout. The KGB compiled a list of 73 suspect nodes, bases, relay stations, encryption centers. Any facility that had failed to return signal was flagged. Their commanders were interviewed, technicians questioned, career records scrubbed for signs of ideological unreliability. One officer, a 28-year-old comms analyst in Sevastopol, was detained for 48 hours simply because he had requested an unauthorized signal timing chart the week before the failure. He was released with no charges, but never reassigned to a high-security post again. The real source of the failure remained untouched, because this theory, like the first, was a diversion. While KGB agents hunted ghosts, missile crews sat in silence, still shaken by the moment when Moscow had vanished from the ether. Some units began drafting their own local fallback plans, quiet. Unofficial protocols for what to do if silence returned. That, in itself, was heresy. Soviet nuclear doctrine did not allow for autonomy. Units did not act without orders. But now, the people who lived through the blackout had begun asking forbidden questions. What if we never hear from command again? Do we wait until we're destroyed? Do we prepare, or pretend inside the general staff? Fear turned inward. Because if the truth got out that a single systems error had taken down every layer of strategic communication, then confidence in deterrence would collapse, not just among enemies, but among the troops expected to launch. So the sabotage theory stood, never proven, never acted upon, but powerful enough to silence dissent and bury the one conclusion no one dared admit: that the most dangerous vulnerability in the Soviet nuclear arsenal was built into its own design. It took 3 weeks for the audit teams to uncover the real cause, buried in a routine software update pushed to synchronization servers across the strategic rocket forces. A single line of code intended to harmonize timing between authentication systems created a fatal timing drift between backup communication channels. The patch had been signed off by 3 independent design bureaus. It had passed checksum verifications. It had even been flagged for expedited deployment to reduce protocol lag under crisis conditions. But in its eagerness to unify timing, it introduced a system-wide dependency linking channel validation to a shared timing heartbeat. That heartbeat failed at 22:41 Moscow time, And with it, everything else did too. The satellite uplink servers rejected commands outside the new timing window. The wired relays treated all incoming packets as expired. Ultra-low frequency signals were flagged as unsynchronized and dropped. Even the courier dispatch terminals halted. Unable to reconcile timestamps between origin and receiver, each system behaved exactly as designed. Each one independently refused to process invalid commands. But all of them had been poisoned by the same fix. The terrifying part. No one caught it during testing. Why? Because the update had been simulated under ideal conditions, not stress-tested during full-force drills or partial outages. And once deployed, it didn't cause outright failure. It created a silent contradiction. The first sign of trouble wasn't error, it was no response at all. When the logs were reviewed, one analyst at the Communications Security Bureau summed it up in a single sentence. The redundancy worked perfectly. That's why everything failed. This was the intelligence failure. A system designed to survive nuclear war had no way to handle a software bug, because no one believed software could break all the layers at once. The patch was never recalled. It was silently replaced. No incident was logged in the Central Readiness Archive. Instead, the episode was marked Routine Relay Reconfiguration. All original diagnostic logs were sealed. All personnel involved signed non-disclosure agreements, and across the military, a new protocol quietly entered classified training. In the event of multi-channel silence, do nothing. Await visual confirmation. Assume no launch unless confirmed by sensor or impact. A doctrine of stillness born from terror. The field units never knew the truth. They were told it had been solar activity, or jamming, or a brief power imbalance, but in hidden meeting rooms deep inside Moscow, a new awareness took root that the system was too centralized, too interlinked, too vulnerable to the kind of failure that doesn't explode. It erases. This wasn't an enemy action. It was a design flaw so subtle. It simulated nuclear sabotage without a single warhead being fired, and the cost of discovering it, 30 minutes of silence. 30 minutes when nobody knew who was in charge. While the Soviet Union was silencing its own terror, the United States had already designed around the very failure that had just crippled its adversary. Redundancy in the American Strategic Command System didn't mean multiple systems doing the same job. It meant multiple systems that could disagree and still function. Each branch of communications satellite, airborne, hardline, VLF submarine comms was developed by separate contractors, maintained by independent chains of custody, and updated with staggered, purposefully asynchronous timing protocols. In the event of failure, American systems didn't collapse in unison. They split, reported anomalies, and fell back to pre-established defaults, each designed not to trust any single channel. It wasn't elegant, but it was resilient. Consider the National Military Command System, NMCS, the nerve center for U.S. nuclear forces. Its architecture was built around an assumption the Soviets never made one day. Every primary system will fail at once. From that assumption, U.S. doctrine created not just backups, but decision diversity. Example, if an airborne command post lost satellite link, it wouldn't just wait or freeze, it would activate semi-autonomous command overlays via the Emergency Rocket Communication System, ERCS, using repurposed Minuteman missiles to blast low-band communications directly into the upper atmosphere. If a submarine lost ALF pings, it didn't stall. It activated dead reckoning time windows and surfaced during emergency sync intervals. In other words, they planned to fight through the silence. Drills were brutal. One 1982 simulation saw all primary and secondary channels severed mid-drill. The crews rerouted via hardened airborne command circuits within 90 seconds. Confirmation of readiness was restored without a single missile crew needing to guess, stall, or escalate. What the Soviets saw as chaos, the Americans called modularity. There were no sacred clocks. Zulu time reigned supreme, but systems were designed to challenge, verify, and even reject orders that didn't align. No one layer trusted another completely. Because U.S. command understood a lesson the Soviet Union had only just begun to fear. In a real war, the system is not your ally. Humans must be trained not to wait, but to think. Fail-safes must be able to fail safely. And the worst scenario is not enemy missiles. It's your own logic firing too early, or worse, not at all. The Americans didn't trust perfection. They designed for confusion. So when all channels went dark in Soviet territory in April 1985, the USSR would have done something the Soviets couldn't. They would have continued the mission, not by guessing, not by launching, but by using systems that could survive being wrong. The Soviet system punished disobedience. The American system punished blindness. And in the terrifying, paralyzing silence of simultaneous failure. That difference meant everything. The failure never reached Pravda. There were no public inquiry, no televised resignations, no state funerals for a system that died but left no corpses. But inside Soviet Strategic Command, the silence was deafening. A month after the incident, the Communications Directorate convened a closed-door tribunal, less an investigation than a performance. The objective was clear: assign blame, contain the narrative, and ensure that no one pointed upward. The fall guy was a mid-level systems engineer named Oleg Biryukov. He hadn't written the faulty patch. He hadn't signed off on its deployment. But his name was on the implementation log at the main satellite uplink in Chekhov. That was enough. Biryukov was quietly reassigned to an Arctic radar station. He would spend the next 9 years scanning empty skies, never allowed near secure networks again. The rest of the fallout was quieter and far more destructive. A general in the Strategic Rocket Forces, once praised for his flawless readiness doctrine, was removed from the General Staff rotation list. His operational clearance was downgraded. His memoirs, later published in exile, never mentioned the incident but hinted at it. Sometimes the silence we fear most is the one we built ourselves. Submarine fleet commanders began conducting unauthorized communications drills. Some crews developed informal contingency plans, unsanctioned checklists for no-contact scenarios. These rogue practices were quietly tolerated, but never acknowledged. Meanwhile, a classified report circulated among the top echelon. Title: Unified Systems Interruption Event, April 85, finding a single logic failure. Disabled all primary and backup communication systems. Consequence: total command paralysis for 27 minutes. Risk level catastrophic. Recommendation: diversify timing protocols. Establish independent channel controllers. Status filed, then sealed. No reforms followed. Why? Because doing so would admit the truth that for almost half an hour, the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal was cut off from its brain, that missile crews, submarines, and bombers waited, alone, in the dark, and that no one, not engineers, not generals, not even the Politburo, understood how close they came to chaos. There was no war, no strike, no loss of life, but something was broken, something beyond code and wires. Trust. Officers no longer trusted the system to work without oversight. Crews began second-guessing drills. Doctrine was obeyed, but not believed. The humiliation wasn't the failure. It was that the failure revealed how fragile their perfection truly was, and how close the Soviet Union had come to launching a war not out of hate or fear, but out of silence. The Soviet Union had always viewed its nuclear doctrine not just as a weapon, but as an ideological triumph, a seamless system where control, order, and obedience guaranteed survival. In contrast to the West's perceived chaos and decentralization, the Soviet chain of command was a monument to discipline, no action without instruction, no instruction without Moscow. That monument cracked in April 1985. The communications failure didn't just expose a flaw in protocol, it undermined the entire philosophical foundation of Soviet deterrence. Because for all the parades, all the missiles, all the maps inked with targeting grids and red lines, the truth was this: the system had no answer for silence. No doctrine accounted for it. No authority was distributed. The machine was too centralized, too synchronized, too elegant to survive a glitch that didn't even come from an enemy. The irony was brutal. The very features that made the Soviet command system seem invulnerable, unified timing, uniform protocol, centralized decision-making became the vectors of collapse, a single logic update, pushed to increase efficiency, instead synchronized failure across every channel. A system built to survive war had been paralyzed by maintenance. And that ideological collapse didn't stop at the general staff. Junior officers began to see drills differently. Warhead crews took longer to validate orders. Submarine captains hesitated just a breath longer before opening the next sealed envelope. The mythology of invincibility had been punctured. Worse, it couldn't be acknowledged, so it festered. Because to admit this truth publicly, or even internally, would mean rewriting not just the comms manual, but the Cold War playbook itself. So the system did what totalitarian systems do best. It buried the wound, declared the patient healthy, locked the report away in a drawer marked "Never happened." But in war rooms and silos, in barracks and briefing halls, the lesson had been learned, not by policy, but by memory. The officers who lived through it never forgot those minutes, the hollow stare of blank screens, the waiting, the creeping fear that Moscow was gone, and that they would be expected to act without knowing if anyone remained to justify it. And they understood. Finally, a truth the Americans had long since baked into their systems. Control isn't power. Redundancy isn't security. Only independence makes survival possible. The Soviet Union's strategic brain had built itself a perfect cage, and on the day it lost the key, it learned the cost of believing a machine could think for them. Today, the bunkers still exist, buried beneath forests, hidden in mountain caverns, deep in the permafrost of the Far East. Relics of Soviet strategic command sleep under dust and darkness. Their control panels are obsolete, their warheads long since dismantled. But the fear lingers not in the circuitry, but in the silence. Veterans of the 1985 blackout call it the hush. A moment when radios worked but said nothing, when orders didn't come, when clocks kept ticking, but meaning vanished. No missiles launched, no enemies attacked, no names were entered into history books. But for 27 minutes, the world stood unknowingly on a precipice, because a system that was supposed to be invincible, designed to scream in crisis, whispered nothing. Today's Russian military operates on vastly modernized digital infrastructure. Communications are encrypted, distributed, multipathed, but buried deep in doctrine are strange little protocols, old rules for verifying local readiness if command goes dark, offline fallback training, satellite drop checks, No one says where those came from, because no one officially remembers. But the ghost is there. It lives in the margins of classified briefings, in the nervous glances exchanged during drills, in the paper manuals that still list steps for when every channel goes silent. Not because anyone expects it to happen again, but because it already did, and it nearly brought the end not with fire, not with betrayal, but with a bug, a line of code, a forgotten dependency. The most terrifying weapon of the Cold War wasn't the warhead. It was the assumption that someone would always be there to say go or stop. If you found this breakdown chilling, fascinating, and worth remembering, subscribe to this channel. We publish Cold War deep dives every week showing how missteps, machines, and misunderstood doctrine almost rewrote history. Stay alert, stay informed,